My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. In this edition of the show, we will take a look at the NRA, specifically at the latest malfeasance by NRA Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierre. As you may recall, LaPierre and NRA management are the subject of an investigation into misappropriating up to $64 million of members' money by Letitia James, the leftist Attorney General for the state of New York. Instead of opening the organization to reform, however, LaPierre and company have circled the wagons to stay in power and, of course, to keep bilking members. Bear in mind that New York wants to dissolve the country's primary gun rights organization with a potentially disastrous impact on gun rights. So what the leadership has done right here in Charlotte just last weekend, the NRA leadership, shocks even me. More on that later in the show. But first, this just in gun rights news. Smith & Wesson has announced that it's moving its headquarters from Springfield, Massachusetts to Marysville, Tennessee by the year 2023, investing $125 million in its new property and bringing 750 jobs with them. Smith & Wesson just became the latest gun manufacturer to escape leftist bastions in the Northeast, this time in the face of legislation which would ban the manufacture of modern semi-automatic firearms in the state of Massachusetts. Smith & Wesson will be joining Beretta, Barrett Arms, and Troy Industries, all of which relocated from anti-gun states to Tennessee. Other gun companies fleeing the Northeast, in many cases for Texas, include Colt, Remington, and O.F. Mossberg & Sons. Magpul Industries also pulled up stakes in Colorado after that state passed a magazine ban. You know, I have a good feeling about this. If the worst happens and the U.S. heads toward another civil war, we will have all the guns. Elsewhere, you've probably heard that murder in the U.S. rose dramatically in 2020. But did you know it's your fault? Yes, says the Washington Post, and I quote, "The FBI's annual tabulation of crime data, released on Monday, showed that killings in the United States increased nearly 30% last year, the largest annual increase on record. An additional 4,901 people were killed in 2020 compared with 2019, bringing the total to 21,500. Many factors are at play, including an unprecedented pandemic that caused economic and mental stress, but what is most striking is the undeniable role played by guns." The piece then goes on to blame the horrific spike in violence across the U.S. on concealed carry laws, claiming, and I quote, "Instead of putting in place sensible gun control, such as bans on assault weapons, universal background checks, safe, secure laws with stiff secure laws, whatever that is, with stiff consequences, Congress has remained gridlocked. Meanwhile, Republican-led states have enacted laws, such as the one that went into effect in July in Tennessee, that allows most adults to carry openly or concealed a handgun without a permit, God forbid. The rising and spreading murder statistics should raise the alarm that it's time to stop despairing over the damage done by guns and do something about it." What is conspicuously lacking, of course, is an admission that the vast majority of the increase in crime is occurring in cities with Democrat leadership, which have encouraged the rioting that followed the killing of George Floyd, forced police to back off from enforcing the law by persecuting them for doing their jobs, and doing like our own little Portland, Oregon here in North Carolina, otherwise known as Asheville, has done, namely to defund police. In truth, the spike in gun buying in 2020 is not the cause of the violence, it is the result of the violence. Violence which resulted from a defund police movement that was every bit as bad an idea as it sounds. Now, let the record reflect that I predicted this months ago right here on the show, and here is why. An acquaintance recently equated recent civil unrest with that of the 1960s, but I said to him that's not true. What's different is that in the 1960s, when radicals rioted and burned cities, governmental leaders deployed law enforcement to stop the violence. Today, by contrast, the radicals who foment violence in the 1960s are the people in power in those cities. And instead of trying to stop the anarchy, they are enabling it. And those radicals know Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals. They know that to create the great socialist utopia they envision, they must first destroy the existing society. And how better to increase governmental control, including the gun control agenda they will invariably push, is to make sure that anarchy happens. That is what the left does. To create a problem, blame you for it, and then to step in to solve it with more governmental control and the curtailment of your civil liberties. None of this is an accident, folks. And if you're prone to think I'm espousing some grand conspiracy theory, let me recount a phrase from one of my board members who once said, and I quote, "You don't have to be a member of the choir to sing from the same piece of sheet music." And speaking of the defunding of police and resulting up-arming of the citizenry, how's that going? Well, according to the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, as reported in a website called The Truth About Guns, and I quote, "The FBI Uniform Crime Report for 2020 indicates that armed private citizens killed more criminals during the commission of a felony last year than were killed by police." And the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms says the data clearly underscores the continuing need for American gun ownership. And I quote, "We looked at tables 14 and 15 of the FBI's new report that apply to justifiable homicides by law enforcement and private citizens, respectively," noted CCR-KBA Chairman Alan Gottlieb. And last year, according to the data, armed citizens killed 343 criminals during the commission of a felony, while police fatally shot 298 felons. Elsewhere, the weaponization of the Centers for Disease Control has begun. The weaponization of the Centers for Disease Control has begun. You may recall that back in the 1990s, Congress defunded the CDC's gun injury project because its head, Mark Rosenberg, vowed to create a public perception of guns as, and I quote, "dirty, deadly, and banned." And to that end, he started funding phony science, studies whose methodology was designed to produce preordained political conclusions. And many of those anti-gun researchers it spawned, people like Garen Wintemute and our own Phil Cook of Duke University, are names you still see today. For years, gun control advocates have been screaming that Congress prohibited gun injury research, which was a lie. Gun injury research actually continued, including the politically motivated flavor. It just couldn't use your money, public money, to fund its political objectives. Well, under Joe Biden, they're back. The Centers for Disease Control is surveilling America by launching a funded surveillance program called the Firearm Injury Surveillance Through Emergency Rooms, or FASTER. This is a highly concerning development for gun rights supporters, considering the federal government's well-known desire to push gun control initiatives, monitor gun owners, and generally attack the Second Amendment in the United States. Now, the CDC is paying for states to, quote, provide surveillance data in near real time on firearm injuries in emergency rooms. More on this as it develops. Right now, you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. After a short break, we will return with still more information better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Before the break, we were discussing how the Biden administration is weaponizing the Centers for Disease Control by restarting biased research designed to promulgate gun control. And I use the word research loosely. And speaking of weaponization, the the Department of Injustice just announced that it will be unleashing the FBI against, wait for it, parents. Yes, sir, if you have the audacity to object to your children being indoctrinated against America and against you by showing up at a school board meeting, you might end up in the crosshairs of the FBI. Says the National File, and I quote, the Biden regime has officially announced that they will be using the powers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice to criminally investigate concerned parents who attend school board meetings to protest anti-white critical race theory and other controversial educational materials and lessons in public schools. The Biden regime has officially announced that it will be weaponizing the powers of the federal government to criminally investigate and prosecute upset parents who attend public school board meetings to protest critical race theory, as revealed through a stunning letter issued by Attorney General Merrick Garland on Monday. Here's what the DOJ has to say, and I quote, threats against public servants are not only illegal, they run counter to our nation's core values, wrote Attorney General Garland. Those who dedicate their time and energy to ensuring that our children receive a proper education in a safe environment deserve to be able to do their work without fear for their safety. Now, here's what that really means. In the tradition of communist autocracies everywhere, we will decide how your children are indoctrinated. And if you have the nerve to show up at a school board meeting, you may face federal prosecution. And by the way, if you'd like to know where this all started, you can look to the National Association of School Boards, which implored Biden to invoke, of all things, the Patriot Act, saying, and I quote, NSBA requests that you examine appropriate enforceable actions against these crimes under the Patriot Act in regards to domestic terrorism, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and all other applicable federal laws. Incidentally, in the same memo, they falsely claim that critical race theory is not being taught in schools. Apparently, there is no lie they will not tell. Anyway, you heard it. The Marxists running the School Board Association want to make you a domestic terrorist for having the audacity to object to your children being propagandized. This is precisely what I predicted right here in episode 81 of Guns, Politics, and Freedom, when in June, the DOJ issued its National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. In case you've forgotten, this was an impressive 32-page tome which purported to address the main threat to America, namely domestic violent extremists. In a word, you. Forget Antifa, forget BLM, forget ISIS, and especially forget the Taliban, since after all, they're our friends now, haven't you heard? At least they better be, since Uncle Joe gave them a few $1 billion worth of our weapons. But anyways, nope, the principal threat to America is now parents who don't want their children indoctrinated with the Marxist ideology they call critical race theory. As an activist for 27 years, let me tell you what that means. Specifically, what it means when you apply pressure to a political target, in this case, the Marxists trying to take over America. And that target begins to whine or to scream or to threaten. What it means is that you are getting to them, that you are winning. And what do you do when they react like this? You double down. Don't back off. Increase the pressure. Show up at school board meetings and call out leftists for what they are. Have your relatives show up. Have your friends show up. Because that is the only way you will break them. And speaking of standing up to critical race theory and its Marxist adherents, kudos to our own Johnston County, which, by the way, I don't know why Johnston County, but it seems to be ground zero for the culture war here in North Carolina. Anyways, Little Johnston County made national news this week. It seems that on October 1st, the Johnston County School Board voted unanimously to adopt a policy that would discipline or dismiss teachers if they incorporate critical race theory into their teaching of the history of the United States. And why would the school board, which is likely dominated by leftists, do such a thing? Do something so consistent with mainstream American values? Well, that's because Johnston County's Republican-run Board of Commissioners voted to withhold $7.9 million in school funding until the policy was passed. The News and Observer of Raleigh reported, and says the document, and I quote, "Racism causes damage to individuals and the community. When racism is present, it creates a lack of trust and respect." The document reads, "No student or staff member shall be subjected to the notion that racism is a permanent component of American life. When it comes to U.S. history, the policy states that all people deserve full credit and recognition for their struggles and accomplishments through United States history, and that the nation's founding documents, quote, shall not be undermined. It banned any Johnston County Schools employee from, quote, making any attempt to discredit the efforts made by all people using foundational documents for reform." And it further says, and I quote, "No fictional accounts or narratives shall be used to invalidate actual objective historical events. All people who contributed to American society will be recognized and presented as reformists, innovators, and heroes to our culture," it added. "Failure to comply with this policy will result in disciplinary action up to and including dismissal." Of course, the teachers' union didn't like that much. The new policy was denounced by April Lee, president of the Johnston County Association of Educators and an 8th grade social studies teacher, who said, "The school system is, quote, selling our souls to the devil for $7.9 million. I'm not really sure why April is invoking the devil, since, after all, good Marxists are generally atheists, aren't they? Anyways, quote, "It's basically extortion," Lee said in an interview. "They're holding money hostage until they get a policy that is extreme enough for them to approve. We should all be angry about that." Yeah, we're the extremists, right? Take notes on that, folks, because that's how you do it. That's how you hold their feet to the fire. Also, right here in North Carolina, one of Raleigh's official leftist propaganda organs, WRAL, got caught red-handed trying to whitewash Joe Biden's plummeting poll numbers in the state. This just in from Breitbart News, and I quote, Breitbart News inquired with WRAL, a local affiliate in North Carolina, about why the publication was covering up the poll of the President of the United States approval numbers that showed Biden with only a 38% approval in the state and a higher percentage, 48%, of disapproval. The original report from Breitbart News noted that after a few hours of the article being on the organization's website, it was removed, withholding the newsworthy information from its readers. Instead, the link showed an error code of 404 saying, sorry, wrong address. One of WRAL's editors, Matthew Burns, admitted to Breitbart News that he took the article down, saying WRAL is, quote, not interested in polls, while also claiming that, quote, there is no election going on now, and there's no reason to be writing polls and polling stories. However, the story was republished with the same web address link hours after Breitbart News submitted follow-up questions asking if WRAL regularly hides negative news on Democrats from its readers or if this is an isolated incident. Take it from me, folks. It's not. I know WRAL. Anyways, additionally, Breitbart News asked if anyone had contacted or directed Burns from within or outside the news organization, where he's been for over 15 years. Burns has still not responded to follow-up requests. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Here in North Carolina, the battle for the next election has already begun, as the General Assembly holds a series of meetings over political redistricting. Every 10 years, after the census is completed, the General Assembly redraws political districts. Most gun rights supporters fail to realize the importance of political redistricting in the makeup of the legislature and, by consequence, how friendly or hostile it will be to gun rights. The good news is that a political publication called The Hill reports that Democrats are confronting narrowing voter registration advantages in key battleground states ahead of next year's midterm elections, stirring concern among some party members of a coming Republican wave in 2022. And right here in North Carolina, Democrats' historical advantage in voter registration has shrunk by more than 140,000 since October 2019. There are fewer active registered Democrats on the books in North Carolina now than there were 6 years ago. That's the good news. The bad news is that leftists are once again trying to manipulate political districts to their advantage by suing to get leftist judges to overturn the will of voters. A Wall Street Journal article entitled, quote, Scorched Earth Judging in North Carolina describes how the North Carolina Supreme Court, which is still controlled 4-3 by Democrats, may once again overturn the voter ID constitutional amendment approved by voters in a 2018 referendum. Meanwhile, a variety of leftist organizations are already maneuvering to sue to invalidate districts drawn by the Republican-controlled legislature before they are even complete. More on this as it develops. Just this week in Mecklenburg County, we had a hearing for our lawsuit against Mecklenburg County Sheriff Gary McFadden over McFadden's refusal to issue pistol purchase permits and concealed handgun permits within the time periods allotted by state law. The good news is that this is a preliminary injunction to require McFadden to come up with a plan to comply with the law. We do not have a decision yet. The decision should be rendered in about a week. But if the preliminary injunction is not granted, even then the lawsuit will continue. This, by the way, is the third such lawsuit Grassroots North Carolina and Gun Owners of America have filed against North Carolina sheriffs to ensure their compliance with the law regarding pistol permits. Did you know that the NRA just last weekend held its annual meeting right here in Charlotte? You could be forgiven for not knowing, since NRA leadership apparently didn't want you to know. I got wind of it just a few days before the meeting when a friend forwarded a letter he had received from the NRA inviting him to the meeting, which was taking place just 4 days after he got the letter. As you probably heard, the NRA is subject to legal action to dissolve the organization by leftist New York State Attorney General Letitia James over allegations that NRA Executive Vice President Wayne LaPierre and others looted, that's her word, looted the organization, including allegedly misappropriating $64 million of members' money. So, to avoid accountability from its members, they don't want to answer any nasty questions, apparently the NRA decided to have an annual meeting nobody would attend. After canceling its annual meeting and convention in Houston, ostensibly due to COVID, the excuse for everything lately, NRA leaders quietly and belatedly rescheduled it for Charlotte this past weekend, presumably because the bylaws require having some type of annual meeting. Of course, that was after they apparently ensured that they utterly controlled who would attend by changing the minimum notification in the bylaws and changing what constitutes a quorum to 100 people. Yes, at an organization claiming millions of members, a quorum for its annual meeting is 100 people. Even if you're a voting member of the NRA, you probably didn't get notice of the meeting. I'm a voting member, but I didn't get notice, and neither did all but a couple of the people I spoke to, people who are probably not on the NRA's naughty list like I am. Even those who got notice reportedly didn't get it until late in the week prior to the meeting, just days before the meeting. Now, don't take my word for this. My friend Jeff Knox, son of the legendary Neil Knox, the former NRA vice president, who was removed from the NRA board for advocating just these types of reforms, he just did a piece on it for AmmoLand.com. Says Jeff, and I quote, "Under the new bylaws, the association is required to meet the minimum announcement requirements of the state in which the association is incorporated, New York, which offers several options for alerting members to a meeting. The easiest and cheapest, and I would add the one least likely to bring people, of those options is for the association to publish an announcement at least once per week for 3 weeks prior to the scheduled meeting in a newspaper in the local area of the association's primary business location," presumably New York, not North Carolina. But wait, there's more. There was nothing to be voted on at the meeting, the board of directors having already been decided upon. Everyone on the preferred slate was reelected, of course, and all of the write-ins failed. The single resolution to dump LaPierre and Company was reportedly tabled without a vote. Oh yes, the NRA also reportedly claimed credit for state-level gains like we've made in North Carolina, despite the fact that the NRA lobbyist has been utterly absent for the entire legislative session. What all this means is that LaPierre and his cronies on the board of directors have effectively circled wagons to keep themselves in power, and money, of course, to reject reforms that could save the NRA, and to give carte blanche to leftists like Letitia James to destroy the organization. Although I have many times spoken out about the misdeeds of the NRA, such as endorsing anti-gun candidates and greenlighting anti-gun legislation, I have never before said what I am about to say. The NRA may be beyond saving. By all appearances, clearly LaPierre intends to keep siphoning off millions of dollars from hard-working NRA members, and clearly the NRA Board of Directors intends to continue allowing him to do so. By all accounts at this point, LaPierre and company represent little more than a drain on precious resources needed to defend the right to keep and bear arms from the onslaught of the Biden administration. Fortunately, Grassroots North Carolina is very different than the NRA. As an all-volunteer organization, every dime we get goes toward defending your rights and has since 1994. That's why GRNC has been able to pass concealed carry, concealed handgun reciprocity, Castle Doctrine, Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into restaurants, public assemblies, parks, educational properties, and much more. It is why GRNC has killed scores of gun control bills and is suing yet another North Carolina sheriff over refusal to issue handgun permits as required by law. And finally, it is why we have gotten both the purchase permit repeal and concealed carry in churches, which are co-located with educational properties. We've gotten both of those through both chambers of the legislature, only to have them vetoed by anti-gun Governor Roy Cooper, whom the NRA once gave an A rating and even donated to his campaign. And yes, we are working on overriding those vetoes. Now, I won't tell you not to contribute to the NRA, but if you decided to adopt the poker player's maxim and not throw good money after bad, please continue contributing for gun rights, and specifically, please contribute to Grassroots North Carolina. You can help us defend your rights by going to grnc.org. That's grnc.org. I can't predict what will happen to gun rights in the future, either with or without the NRA. But what I can say with certainty is that as a lean, mean, all-volunteer gun rights organization, Grassroots North Carolina will use your money to defend your rights more efficiently and effectively than any other group. Right now, you're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with still more critical information enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Controversy has recently arisen over passage in the U.S. House of H.R. 4350, the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, which is the annual defense bill funding the military, over a provision added by Representative Jackie Speier of California, Democrat, which effectively creates red flag gun confiscation for military personnel. What's causing the controversy is that 135 Republicans voted for final passage of the bill, including most of the North Carolina delegation. This has caused at least 2 Republican congressmen to issue statements on why they did it. Said Representative Greg Murphy, and I quote, "I'm outraged that House Democrats are once again trying to conceal unconstitutional red flag laws in the NDAA that could be used to unjustly deprive American service members of their Second Amendment rights. Our national defense bill is a key component of ensuring that our armed forces and their families have the resources they need, and it is reprehensible that Democrats are trying to use the NDAA to subvert our veterans' right to possess a firearm. Fortunately, both Republican and Democrat leadership have publicly assured Congress that this egregious language will be removed from the final version of the NDAA. While I support the overall defense legislation as a vital pillar of Eastern North Carolina's defense footprint and look forward to its passage, I will work tirelessly within conference to ensure that law-abiding veterans' Second Amendment rights are protected from unlawful federal overreach. Similarly, Representative Madison Cawthorn said, and I quote, "I want to be clear, I do not support red flag laws. Some of my best supporters have seen posts and memes saying I do. This is a lie. I did not vote for red flag laws. I voted to send the National Defense Authorization Act to the Senate so they can strip out radical red flag language, draft our daughters language, etc." The House must vote on the National Defense Authorization Act again before the bill is sent to the White House. If the Democrats' radical red flag language is still in the bill, I will vote no. Think of the NDAA like a football. The House has to snap the football to the quarterback before they can reach the end zone. It may look like the ball was thrown the wrong way when it's snapped to the quarterback, but it's done so the quarterback can run the right way and score a touchdown. My colleagues in the Senate have told me that the language will be stripped out. I received a letter last night from the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee also promising to strip out such language. I attach it below for others to read. I also announced a standalone bill last week to ban red flag laws. Friends, I will never abandon the Second Amendment community. They are my closest supporters. Share this with your friends to fight misinformation. I promise I will never abandon you. I will fight to protect the Second Amendment. There it is. On one hand, the fact that the bill was deliberately structured to be a mixed issue, in other words, it would force any Republican voting against it to vote against military funding, that makes it understandable that Republicans would vote for the bill. On the other hand, 2 North Carolina Republicans did vote against H.R. 4350 and its red flag provision, namely Dan Bishop and Ted Budd, both of whom deserve credit for standing strong against gun control. We're being told that the red flag language will not be in the final bill. We'll see. Since the bill is now in the Senate, call Senators Richard Burr and Thom Tillis and tell them to oppose any bill containing red flag provisions or other gun control. Elsewhere, a recent op-ed appeared in the Washington Post entitled "Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here," to which I find it necessary to respond. It was written by Robert Kagan, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and contributing columnist for the Post. I'm addressing it because it neatly encapsulates what you are facing from the left. What follows are his central points, followed by my rebuttals. Kagan says, and I quote, "The United States is heading into the greatest political and constitutional crisis since the Civil War, with a reasonable chance over the next 3 to 4 years of incidents of mass violence, a breakdown of federal authority, and the division of the country into warring red and blue enclaves." Well, I guess this might be one of those rare moments when I have to agree with the left. Unfortunately, the writer posits all the wrong reasons for the crisis, as leftists are wont to do. He blames Donald Trump for the crisis, but this has nothing to do with Trump. He merely stepped into a role that has been sought by mainstream Americans for decades. The same role filled by Ronald Reagan, and that is the role of defending our culture and our system of government against an onslaught by leftists determined to make it into something very different. Kagan says, quote, "Conservatives believe the U.S. government and society have been captured by socialists, minority groups, and sexual deviants." Well, for a leftist, I suppose 1 out of 3 ain't bad. Socialists, yes. As for minorities and sexual deviants, few Trump supporters actually oppose such people until those people or people from those groups try to undermine fundamental American values. The fact that leftist values dominate those categories, not their race or sexual preference, is what makes them antithetical to American society. But lacking a cogent argument, leftists invariably try to brand conservatives as racist or homophobic. Kagan says, quote, because the Trump movement is less about policies than about Trump himself, it has undermined the normal role of American political parties, which is to absorb new political and ideological movements into the mainstream. Well, that's because the, quote, normal role of American parties has lost its course as it created a new elite class, what has been dubbed the deep state, which transcends parties, corrupting players from both parties whose chief goal becomes retaining power and privilege. Idiots like Mitt Romney and the late John McCain exemplify the failure of the Republican Party to hold to its roots. Kagan says the banal normalcy of the great majority of Trump's supporters, including those who went to the Capitol on January 6th, has befuddled many observers. Although private militia groups and white supremacists played a part in the attack, 90% of those arrested or charged had no ties to such groups. The majority were middle class and middle-aged. 40% were business owners or white-class workers. They came mostly from purple, not red counties. Bingo! When the banal normalcy opposes your agenda, maybe they are onto something, don't you think? Those are what Patrick Buchanan once dubbed the peasants with pitchforks, and they should scare you because when they come together, as they did on January 6th, leftists bent on reimagining our government don't stand a chance. Kagan says, quote, the events of January 6, on the other hand, prove that Trump and his most diehard supporters are prepared to defy constitutional and democratic norms, just as revolutionary movements have in the past. Defying constitutional and democratic norms? Is that so? Well, let me quote Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Kagan says, and I quote, we are already in a constitutional crisis. The destruction of democracy might not come until November 2024, but critical steps in that direction are happening right now. In a little more than a year, it may be impossible to pass legislation to protect the electoral process in 2024. But we are in a constitutional crisis because you and others like you insist on calling our government a democracy. It is not. It was designed to be a constitutional republic, not a democracy, because democracies are subject to the tyranny of the majority, something you are working hard to exploit right now by illegally importing voters across our borders to ensure a perpetual lock on power by the left. What's most ironic is that this writer, Kagan, like most leftists, refuses to acknowledge that he espouses philosophies fundamentally at odds not only with the Constitution and Bill of Rights, but the vision of the framers in designing what has been the most successful government since the Roman Empire, affording citizens the greatest civil liberties in human history. Most of Trump's supporters aren't behind him because they love him. Hell, I think the guy's a jerk. But as John Dalberg Acton put it, Lord Acton, and I quote, great men are almost always bad men. The point is that whatever his personality, the policies he stands for, America first, secure borders, traditional American values, projecting strength in foreign policy, less governmental intervention and control, all of these things are what mainstream Americans have longed to return to for decades. Mr. Kagan, we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis because you and your kind have precipitated it. And what happens next is up to you. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at HyattGuns.com. You can also check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, spell out the and, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of the show. See you next week.